On December 2nd, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that humanity is waging a suicidal war on nature. What are your thoughts on his assessment?
Increasingly, in the last few decades and centuries, we've developed the idea that somehow we humans can survive without our planet, our home. Somehow the air that we breathe, the water we drink, the food that we eat, the resources that provide everything we have and own, somehow we could live without those, as if we and our economy could float around in outer space without everything that our planet provides. The reality is that nature doesn't need us, we need nature. We depend on this planet for everything we have. And so when we destroy nature, when we pollute our air, when we reduce our water, when we use up all of our natural resources and do not distribute those in an equitable manner, we are harming ourselves.
For a variety of reasons, the COVID pandemic being but one of them, the Italian presidency for the IF20 is emphasizing healing. This sets a tone for dialogue that may be more suitable to initiatives and recommendations than any kind of demands. If you were given an opportunity to engage in dialogue with the G20 leaders about climate change, what approach would you take and why? Initiatives, recommendations, demands?
We often feel as if climate change is maybe on our priority list individually or as a city or state or a country. It's on our priority list, but it's too low. And so we need to move it up. That's often the way we approach climate action. I'm a climate scientist, so you would think it'd be pretty close to the top of my priority list, but I have to tell you something. I don't think climate change should be on our priority list at all. Yes, I don't think that climate change should be on our priority list because the only reason why we care about climate change is because of what is already at the top of our priority list today. So here's our priority list, and here's climate change, and it connects directly to everything we already care about today. Look at the Sustainable Development Goals. I know that climate action is down there at number 13, but if it were me, I would take it off the list and I would put it in sort of an overarching banner across the Sustainable Development Goals, because climate change is, as the US military calls it, a threat multiplier. I care about climate change because it exacerbates poverty, hunger, lack of access to clean water, lack of access to basic health care, gender equity, a healthy economy. Go right down the list of Sustainable Development Goals. Climate change affects every single one of those. So if I'm talking to a person, a leader, a regular human being, if I'm talking to anybody about climate change, I want to start that conversation not by talking to them, but by listening. I want to know what matters to them. What are the concerns at the very top of their priority list? And then once I know what those are, 9 times out of 10, or frankly, 99 times out of 100 these days, we can connect those exact concerns to climate change and show them how who they already are is the perfect person to care about climate change. And climate action makes them an even more authentic and enables an even more genuine expression of their values and their concerns than what they have today.
From your perspective, how does racism factor into climate change issues? And what can be done to specifically address the racist dimension of climate change issues?
Climate change is a threat multiplier that is highlighting the fault lines that already run through our society today. Climate change disproportionately affects people who are already vulnerable, who are already marginalized. And climate change is profoundly unfair. It affects women and children more than men, especially in poor countries. It affects communities of color here in the United States and around the world. It affects Indigenous communities. It affects disabled communities. It affects people who are poor, people who are in poor health. It affects the elderly more than those of us who are a little younger. Climate change magnifies all the disparities and all the injustices that we have. And so that's why climate action is so important, because not only does it reduce the impacts of climate change, but it also reduces the growing and increasing injustices in our world today. Let me just give you one example. Since the 1960s, climate change has already increased the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world by 25%. That has already happened. Let me give you another example. air pollution from burning fossil fuels is responsible for an average of 8 million deaths every year. And just for perspective, so far we have about 2.5 million deaths globally from COVID. Each death is too many, don't get me wrong. But why are we not talking about the 8 million deaths, many of which occur in communities that are poor, in communities that are disadvantaged? Here in the United States, many of those occur in traditionally Black communities and Hispanic communities too. We see that climate change, air pollution, and COVID are all part of this toxic stew of issues that are pushing those down who are already down, that are continuing to enrich the rich at the expense of the poor.
In relation to climate change, what message do you have for the G20 leaders and why? What do you think that the G20 might be uniquely placed to do in this arena?
Climate change is a global issue and we need global solutions. Climate change affects all of us differently, but we're all affected. Climate change solutions look different in every place, but there are solutions that every single one of us can engage in. And as leaders, we need leaders to set an example. We need leaders to put in place policies that make it possible for people to have access to clean energy, for people to breathe cleaner air, for people to be able to have enough food in a changing world where we're already losing an average of $5 billion of crops every year due to the impacts of climate change. We need to live in a world where people can afford insurance as disasters increase and multiply, where people can have a safe home to live in as sea level rises and as hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones get stronger. We need our leaders to recognize that we have been living for centuries and even millennia as if we're driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror. What I mean by that is we have assumed that the conditions we've seen in the past that determine how we build our infrastructure, where and how we grow our food, how we allocate our energy and our water and our other resources, we assume that those conditions we've seen in the past are a reliable and accurate guide for the future. It's like driving down the road, looking in the rearview mirror, assuming that the past will tell you where to go in the future. And it works if the road is straight. It works if climate is not changing. But today, climate is changing faster than any time in the history of human civilization on this planet. And that is why, as leaders, it is time to take our eyes off the rearview mirror and put them ahead down the road to understand that our collective bus already has its wheels on the rumble strip. We are already starting to tip over a little bit as we hit the side of the road. We need to correct our course to prepare for the impacts we can no longer avoid and to do everything we can to avoid the impacts that we can.
In relation to climate change, what message do you have for religious leaders and why? What do you think that religious leaders are uniquely placed to do in this area?
As Scottish philosopher David Hume first said, science can tell us what is. In the case of climate change, science can tell us that climate is changing, humans are responsible, and the risks are serious. But once we start talking about how we respond to that information, as he said, that's where ought comes into it. What should we do? How ought we to respond to this challenge? And in determining how to respond, that's where our values come in. Because our values help us to prioritize, help us to respond. Another way I think about it is with a compass and a map. Science is like the compass. It can tell us which way is east or west or north or south, but the map shows us where we want to go. And for many of us, over 80% of us around the world, our values, our map comes from our faith. As a Christian, I believe that we are to care for the poor and the vulnerable, as it says in the Bible, the widows and the orphans. I believe, as it says in Genesis, that we have been given as humans a special responsibility to care for, protect, keep the earth and every living thing in it, which includes our fellow sisters and brothers around the world, as well as plants and animals. And I believe at the very end of the Bible, it says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. And so my values, which are based on my faith, are the reason why I am a climate scientist. Values of stewardship and caring for the poor and the vulnerable are not unique to Christianity. They are among the basic tenets of just about every single major religious tradition. And they're important to people who would perceive themselves or call themselves to be humanists or atheists too, because it's about being a human living on this planet. We already have every value we need to care about the health of our home And as a human, we also have compassion on those who are needy. We understand that urge to help when we see suffering. But what's happened today with climate change is too often that suffering is removed. We don't see it. It's real, it's here, it's now. And the only way we can avoid it is by climate action.
From your perspective, what is the biggest barrier to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, and what can your network, faith-based or science-based, do to address it?
The biggest barrier to action, so social scientists tell us, is that we don't think that we can make a difference. We lack a sense of what they call efficacy, and we don't think it matters to us. We don't think these issues are at the top of our priority list. But of course, with poverty, hunger, disease, lack of access to clean water, education, equity, and then you pile climate change and coronavirus and all kinds of other disasters on top of that, it matters to every single one of us on this planet, no matter who we are and where we live. And in terms of what we can do about it, one of the most important things that any of us can do, any of us, no matter who we are, no matter where we live, is to talk about it, to talk about why these things matter and what we and other people are already doing or could do to help fix them, because that addresses both the psychological distance, we don't think it matters, and the lack of efficacy, we don't think we can make a difference. Make no mistake, system-wide change is needed, but a system is made up of individuals, people. Each of us as individuals has our sphere of influence. It might be our family, it might be our place of work, it might be our place of education, it might be our place of worship. We all have people that we can talk to, because the way the world has changed in the past is not a mystery. It's through changing what people perceive to be the right way to live. We saw with slavery, with votes for women, with civil rights, with smoking, with using plastic bottles even. We see that social norms have changed when people have decided that's not the way the world should be. And they have not only made changes in their own lives, they have talked about it. People as individuals, people as places of worship, people as in corporations and organizations, universities, governments. Talking about how the world can and should be different is the #1 key step to affecting long-term change. And we know from history that that type of change truly can change the world.